Are you fascinated by unsolved mysteries that hit close to home? Sins of the South, 3 Oklahoma cold cases by victim advocate Raven Rollins, dives into a trio of haunting crimes from around the state. From a deadly New Year's Eve for Shauna Jones in Henrietta, to Daniel Furr in Ada, whose family still questions if they truly found his body, and Sheila Davini, whose Maysville house fire was initially ruled accidental but later amended to homicide. Sins of the South is available now in paperback, ebook, and through your favorite library app. Find a retailer at ravenrollins.com. Then check out Sins of the South, 3 Oklahoma cold cases. Can you help solve a mystery?
Deep in the wilderness of Shenandoah National Park, a tent stands silent. A long slash down the side reveals sleeping bags and scattered gear. Branches sway overhead. Birds call in the distance. No witnesses, no clear motive. As the breeze swells and the leaves rustle, only questions are left in the air, unanswered for decades.
From chilling novels and psychological thrillers to horror short stories, film and screenplays, to true crime, podcasts, music, and the art of storytelling itself, Dreadfully Yours invites listeners into conversations with the minds behind the stories that stay with us. Hosted by author, audiobook narrator, and podcaster Raven Rollins, each chapter blends cinematic narration with intimate discussions exploring creativity, suspense, and the human experiences woven into dark storytelling. Welcome to the show where stories linger long after the last page. This is Dreadfully Yours.
In May of 1996, 2 young women, Julianne Julie Williams and Laura Lolly Winans, set out on what should have been the adventure of a lifetime. They were experienced outdoors women, both in their 20s, who met at a Minnesota wilderness program and quickly formed a deep bond. Together they decided to spend Memorial Day weekend backpacking through the rugged beauty of Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. Friends and family recall how excited they were, Julie bringing along her golden retriever mix, Taj, and Lolly with her trademark adventurous spirit. But when the women didn't return as planned, searchers fanned out across the park. Days later, their campsite was discovered, eerily silent. The tent had been slashed open from the outside. Their beloved dog, Taj, was found wandering miles away. And inside the tent lay Julie and Lolly, bound, gagged, and brutally murdered. The brutality stunned even seasoned investigators. The park, considered a sanctuary for hikers and campers, suddenly became the scene of one of the most chilling double homicides in national park history. Despite a massive investigation, the trail quickly went cold. Leads dried up, rumors swirled, and for nearly 3 decades, justice remained elusive. Then enters Kathryn Miles, journalist, environmental writer, professor, and outdoors expert. A woman shaped by the rigors of scientific inquiry, but driven by empathy and obsession all her own. But she first heard about the murders while teaching at Unity College. She was trailed not just by the unanswered questions, but by the lives of Julie and Lolly, brilliant women whose stories deserved to be fully told. Over 4 years, Miles immersed herself in every transcript, interview, forensic file, and haunting memory. She uncovered forensic missteps, timeline mismatches, and investigative leaps that didn't quite land. Her reporting wasn't just meticulous, it was personal. At times, she writes, she felt broken by the evidence. She wept over photographs of the scene, and she became famously relentless in her pursuit of the truth. Trailed, one woman's quest to solve the Shenandoah murders isn't just a cold case book. It's a layered narrative that weaves together the lives of Lolly and Julie, a journalist's obsession, and a damning spotlight on what goes wrong when justice fails people who trusted a place meant to be safe. Miles doesn't stop with the facts. She lays bare the systems that failed them, interrogates cultural biases, especially in spaces where wilderness is still a white male domain, and builds a case for truth, empathy, and accountability. This is more than true crime. It's a love story rendered in forensic detail, a story of justice and grief, of wilderness and vulnerability, and of how one writer's relentless compassion can bring two lives and one case from obscurity into fierce, haunting light. Join me in my conversation with Kathryn Miles.
Today, we are here with award-winning journalist and science writer and outdoors expert, Kathryn Miles. And thank you so much for being here with me today.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So if you want to deep dive into anything that we talk about here today, I suggest you go get trailed. So tell me a little bit about yourself. Where did you grow up? I think I read somewhere that, was it your parents who worked at a newspaper or something like that?
Actually, my godparents, who were kind of like my grandparents. I grew up in the Midwest. We moved around a little bit, but mostly around Iowa and Illinois. And, it was a pretty great childhood, with parents who really loved to car camp and, take us on hikes and take us fishing and things like that. So I think I loved the outdoors from a very early age. I went to college at St. Louis University, thought I was going to be a journalist, but ended up really falling in love with philosophy and gender studies and environmental studies. And so I went on to do a PhD in that and taught college full time for about 15 years. And it was while I was doing that I kind of went back to journalism, always with this kind of environmental scientific focus with it. And so now that's what I do full time.
Oh, awesome. Before we jump into your current book, I know you have 4 others. The first one is Adventures with Ari. Mm-hmm. I love the idea of that one because you kind of are trying to see through your dog's eyes. I just love that idea.
Thank you. I had adopted this very wild puppy who was destroying my house. And so I decided the only way the relationship was going to survive was if we took our program outside. And so we spent a year in nature. And I was, sort of trying to see what does nature look like through a dog's eyes? And because they're this really interesting animal that kind of has a foot in our world and a foot in the wild world. And so she was such a great ambassador into the wilderness for me.
Was her name actually Ari?
It was. Her full name was Bungari Janggab, which is Korean for glove without fingers, because she had one little very dainty white paw. Aww. She was a mix between her dad was a wolf dog, a wolf Siberian Husky mix. Ooh. And then her mom was this Jindo, which is a Korean dog. And so her name was sort of paying homage to her lineage.
Oh, that's awesome. I love that. Let me show you mine. Look at this. Look at this.
Oh my goodness. It's like a little Ewok.
He is. He's with me every time I record. He's under the desk right now.
What is his name?
That's Elvis.
Oh, that is fantastic.
And he's 16 and he just kind of is like, okay, you do your thing up there, Mom. I'm going to take a nap.
He's a distinguished gentleman.
He is. And then, okay, so then your second book, All Standing, that was about a ship and carrying Irish people to escape their country's famine, right?
Right. There were 5,000 of these Irish famine ships, and they had fatality rates that were worse than the slave ships. And there was this one ship out of about 5,000 that managed to keep all of its passengers alive, not just once, but over the course of about 12 journeys. And I was so interested in both what led to the famine and then what led to this mass exodus across the sea, and how it was that a team of crew members could so altruistically do whatever they could to keep these famine immigrants alive.
That's so interesting. And I like pretty much anything that is from I think that was from the 1840s, right?
Exactly.
Okay. Perfect. And then, of course, Superstorm about Hurricane Sandy in 2012, and then Quakeland, which explores earthquake threats in the United States, and you scared us all with that one. So thank you.
That seems to be my new shtick, is I'm the person who goes out of my way to scare you about some subject or another.
Great. I love it. Gonna say this a lot. You talked about this in the book. But what kind of made you decide to go from writing things like this to a true crime book?
Right. Yeah, no, that's a totally fair and good question. You know, the thing that really underlies all of my work, I think, is that I've always been really interested in the relationship that people form with their landscapes, whether it's the built or the natural landscape. And for me, wilderness has always been a really big part of it. And so, you know, with the two books that came before it, I was really interested in the way in which risk and natural disaster was influencing the way people sort of responded to that. You know, I also kind of work as a freelance journalist. And after I had finished Quakeland, I had written a series of articles about a woman who had gone missing on the Appalachian Trail. This incredible woman named Jerry Largay. She was 64. She was a retired nurse, grandmother. She was doing a full hike of the Appalachian Trail, and she went missing here in Maine. And authorities initially really believed that it was foul play. And it was one of the biggest manhunts in Maine history. It took 2 years to unpack what had actually happened to her, which is that she had become just tragically lost. She had 3 days worth of food with her. She managed to keep herself alive for 20 days. And she kept this journal the whole time. And when she realized that she wasn't going to be found, she wrote these love letters to her family, basically saying goodbye. And I had covered that story really intensely. And it was after that really the idea for a trail kind of came about, because I was so interested in kind of who we were on trails. I had been thinking about this particular crime and these two really amazing individuals for like going on 20 years at that point. And so it seemed like sort of a natural progression for me.
That sounds absolutely heartbreaking. She was 64 and she was out there just getting it. That's insane.
She was so hardcore and so brave. And honestly, 3 days worth of food, and she rationed it so that she could stay alive for 20 days. She was a total hero. And so getting a chance to tell her story and getting a chance to get to know her family members and her legacy and things like that was a really meaningful experience for me.
Yeah, a lot of people ask me why I do what I do. And really, I think that maybe we line up here on this, but true crime is human interest. It's human interest stories.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And I think for me personally, the thing with true crime is, I don't get me wrong. I find abnormal psychology and criminal psychology like endlessly fascinating. But for me, the stories of the victims are usually the most interesting and compelling stories. And I think that that's really what motivates me too, is not just who are these killers and why do they kill and how do they kill, but who are the people and the legacies that they leave behind. Yeah.
I don't know anything about this world. Before I read your book, I didn't even know like there was like this whole hiker culture. And it just like, it blew my mind. Like there are shelters and, they have all of these aliases for each other and they're tracking each other's progress. And it's just insane to me. When did you first really jump into this hiking, backpacking sort of world? And was that a shock to you as well?
A little bit, yeah. And it's been so much fun with the release of this book. I mean, there's a lot about this book that's not fun, obviously. But, for me, having had, 1 foot in the hiking culture for a long time and 1 foot in the true crime culture, to get to sort of introduce you all to each other at like this little party that I threw for myself is really fantastic, because they are two really distinct cultures. As I say in the book, I, like Lolly and Julie, I was also a teenage sexual assault survivor. And after that happened, it was a date rape. After it happened, like, I didn't tell anybody about it. And I thought it was my fault. And I spent the next few years just trying to do everything I could to kind of like stay out of my body and act like my body didn't exist. And it wasn't until my junior year in college when I was taking an environmental studies course that had a mandatory backpacking trip on it, which, by the way, I had no idea what I was doing. Like, I showed up with like none of the right gear and like totally underdressed. And I think I threw like a box of cereal in my bag, and I figured I'd eat that for 3 days and
get you some trail mix.
Exactly. It wasn't even peanuts, right? There wasn't even any protein. So I was a total train wreck, but I completely fell in love with it. And it was the first time in a long time that like feeling strong and feeling like back in my body was really important to me. And from that moment forward, backpacking and hiking and solo camping became like my salvation. And I don't even really use that word lightly. Like, it really was, and it was where I felt the safest and the strongest and the most secure. And I think that's why learning that not just these two individuals in my book, Lolly Winans and Julie Williams, but also, 12 other individuals, most of whom were women, had been murdered doing this on the Appalachian Trail, which is where I was spending my time, was just so shocking and shattering to me that, from that day forward, which was 1998, these stories just stuck with me in a way that they were almost always present for me.
So I'm really, really glad that I get to have you on to tell Lolly and Julie's story, because for the most part, for me, I felt like maybe more than half of your book is like almost this love story, to maybe even a love letter to them. Because it's not just about the romance, but it's about what they survived, what they went through growing up, how they found each other, how they found themselves. Would you tell us just a little bit, because like I just said, you go into so much detail in your book, but would you tell us just a little bit about each of the girls?
Absolutely. And let me just say, it warms my heart so much to hear you say that you see this book as part of love story, because that was so important to me. And so I love that got across to readers. Julie and Lolly were really just these extraordinary humans. Julie grew up in a small town in Minnesota in this very tight-knit Catholic community. And by the time she was in high school, her friends were referring to her as a one-woman Peace Corps. She was fluent in Spanish, and she had been translating for domestic abuse survivors. She did missionary work in Central and South America. She was a geologist who had gone on these like crazy digs in Europe and was working on native tribal lands in northern Minnesota. And in May of 1995, she showed up at this really fantastic organization called Woods Women, which was this sort of like feminist-centric approach to outdoor recreation. And she was taking a leadership course there. She wanted to be a guide. And that same month, May of 1995, Lolly Winans showed up to also take the leadership course as part of her internship at a college called Unity College. And Lolly had grown up in this very, very affluent family. She was an incest survivor. She kind of like struggled to make sense of that. But she was also just this like bright and shining star. She was always like the center of any, party or gathering. She loved the Grateful Dead. She loved Fish and other jam bands. She was like the most generous friend you've ever met. And she had really found her calling with this idea of outdoor recreation and the idea that she could create a wilderness therapy program that would let other sexual assault survivors find that same kind of like sense of self and strength in the wilderness that she had found. So they both showed up in May of 1995. By all accounts, it was love at first sight. These two like gorgeous, talented humans just couldn't get enough of each other. And that whole summer was just this really beautiful romance for them. And it was really important to me that I tell not just that story about who they were as individuals, but also this really amazing love story that in a lot of ways was like ahead of its time. It was not easy by any stretch to be out in 1995 and 1996.
No, they were like super brave beyond anything I can imagine. I mean, they're so adventurous, and I wanted to ask you, because you say like in your book they were outdoors experts. You yourself are an outdoors expert. I am a homebody, so I have no idea what that means. And I feel like that some of my listeners probably don't know either. So what does that entail? What does that mean?
Well, for Lolly, for instance, she was at Unity College, this little environmental studies college here in Maine, where I was a professor for 15 years. And so all of the majors at Unity College had an environmental focus. She was studying what at the time was called outdoor recreation, but is now called adventure therapy and leadership. So basically, how do you be an expert guide in the wilderness to take groups out? And, for her, the groups she really wanted to take out were these sexual assault survivors. Julie, had grown up in a family that, canoed and camped and things like that. And so she was going to get similarly trained to be this leader that could take trips. And this organization, Woods Women, was founded by these like badass women in the late 1970s, early 1980s. And they were like, why is the outdoors, why is this such a white male pursuit? That's bullshit, right? And so they created this space where women who had never felt safe in the wilderness or never even thought about, sleeping on the ground in the middle of nowhere could go do that. And so it brought together women from all kinds of different social groups and political beliefs and things like that. They also had a really strong articulated mission for inner city women and their kids who had never had a wilderness experience. And so it was such a just redemptive, holistic, consensus-based place. And it really redefined outdoor recreation and really opened up the wilderness for entire groups of people who had never had the opportunity before.
That's so awesome. I would love to get out. I've gone camping a couple times, but I'm not going to lie to you. It scares me. It terrifies me because I'm that you have that thing in the back of your mind, is the boogeyman out there? You've heard all these stories, and there are organizations out there, even currently, that are trying to help keep people safe, right? When they're camping and when they're hiking. And
that's been one of the things that I've really loved about this book tour is getting a chance to kind of shine a light on some of these organizations, because there are way too many people who feel exactly like you do, and for very good reason, which is am I safe here? Do I belong here? And if you look at glossy magazines dedicated to things like hiking or backpacking or kayaking, it tends to be these buff, attractive white guys. So if you're not a buff, attractive white guy, right? Then do you even belong there? And so for a lot of people, because of their race or their ethnicity or their gender or their sexual orientation, or even just their body type and, body size and things, don't feel like they belong in the wilderness. And so there's been some really great movements in recent years, Outdoor Afro, and my current very favorite organization, which is called Fat Girls Hiking. They have a brand new book out, which is look, we're not the buff, bro, but we still totally want to be out in the wilderness. And they've done so much to create a more inclusive space. And that is very long overdue.
So this case actually came on your radar after you had heard about another case. Which case was that? Was that the Claudia Brenner case? Am I right on that?
Yeah, that was part of it. I was in the fall of 1998, I was backpacking on the Appalachian Trail, and I had stopped for what I thought was the night at this shelter, which is, about every 20 miles, there's a shelter where if you don't want to set up your tent and stuff, you can just kind of sleep there. And it was a spooky November kind of creepy Blair Witchy kind of day. And I was like, all right, I think I'm gonna turn in now. And they were in the process of tearing down that shelter and building another one. And I stopped one of the trail volunteers to ask, why are you tearing down this shelter? And they said, oh, well, we have to because of the murders. And, I was literally sitting there eating an apple. And I was like, wait, what?
Oh, no.
And so as it turned out, this super awesome couple, Molly LaRue and Jeff Hood, had been backpacking through there, had set up at that very shelter where I was sitting for the night, and had been just brutally murdered, which is why they were tearing it down. And so that was so creepy to me. And there was like zero chance that I was going to sleep where this like awful murder had occurred. So I set up my tent like, a half mile down, and had like the worst night of my entire life. Like this thunderstorm came through. I was convinced there was a murderer outside of my tent. It was, I don't know if I've ever been so scared. And when I got back to where I was going to grad school at the University of Delaware, I started doing some research. And that's when I learned about these other murders as well, like Claudia Brenner and Rebecca White, as you mentioned, who were shot. Rebecca White was murdered. Claudia Brenner had 5 bullets in her, and managed to hike out, hoping to save her partner and the love of her life and everything. And so hearing about these stories, I was like, oh my God, like, what is the wilderness,
And speaking of that, so this really has the one thing that has nothing to do with your book. But we've had the Girl Scout murders here in Oklahoma.
Yeah.
And so I was just kind of wondering maybe your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's the case that I've been really interested in too. And it's just one of those cases where, and I was talking to Claudia Brenner after all of this had happened to her. She wrote this amazing book called 8 Bullets, which was about the murder and the aftermath and how hard it was to identify as queer and, have that be part of an investigation. And when I was asking her about the reverberations of these sorts of crimes, what she had said to me was, it kind of doesn't matter why the perpetrator does this violence, whether they're singling out people because of their social group. She said they are absolutely hate crimes in the sense that the reverberations and the ripple effects impact people who identify in that way long after the crime. And I think the Girl Scout murders is a great example of that, of, these crimes that even if you didn't know anyone involved, impact people. I think especially people who identify as female or non-binary so intensely that they're like, if that could happen to them, it could happen to me or my daughter or my child or my niece or my nephew or whoever else, and that's where it really is a hate crime, where there's that primary impact of the victims and the victims' families, but there's a very long-lasting secondary impact of people who are like, oh God, I can't possibly go out into the wilderness.
And speaking of hate crimes, Lolly and Julius was the first federally indicted hate crime, right? Like the first ever.
Right. Yeah. And if you think about it, like they were murdered 2.5 years before Matthew Shepard, and so, it wasn't initially treated as a hate crime. It was only in 2002 when John Ashcraft, who was the Attorney General, announced that this would become the first federal hate crime. And we can kind of unpack whether that was legitimate or not, but it certainly brought the story into really stark national attention, and also, I think, was ultimately part of why that I think some sloppy investigative and prosecutorial work happened, because it became this, very political, very high profile case all of a sudden.
Yeah, and that is usually the downside of, you have ups and downs of getting a high profile or getting the case to be high profile, because you might be able to, track down people that may have seen something or heard something, but then on the complete other hand of that, you've got people who are politicizing the case itself. And so, it's like, where's the happy medium here?
Yeah. And, Lolly and Julie were pretty discreet, which is to say hugely discreet about their relationship, to the point that their family and friends didn't know. They were outed the day of their funerals, and they were outed in the national media. And then when Ashcroft grabbed the case away from the investigators and the prosecutors, again, he made it primarily about their sexuality in a way that their family and friends were really, I think, offended by. And also, I think, tried to force this, square peg into a round hole of this indicted person as this, hate crime, homophobic, misogynistic person, to the point that we see the entire Department of Justice, and especially the FBI, really manipulating evidence in this case in a way that's like borderline criminal, in my opinion.
Yes. And I have so many questions to get to, but yes. But first I wanted to ask you, so I have spoken to several authors, and when they decide to take on one specific true crime case to write a true crime book, it obviously takes a lot of investigating. It takes a lot, like years and years of research and investigation, and you literally have to pour your entire soul into it. Was there ever a point before you maybe fully decided to do this that you were like, man, I don't know if I'm mentally prepared? Is there anything that you did to prepare yourself for this?
Oh, that's such a good question. So I was really worried about undertaking this book project. I was really aware of, Michelle McNamara's story and the real toll that writing All Be Gone in the Dark had on her, which, in not insignificant ways, I think contributed to her very early and tragic death. And, she's one of multiple writers. There's another writer named David Carr who ended up committing suicide, after he was covering these cases. There's a really great environmental writer named Annette McGivney who had covered a really brutal murder that had happened right outside of the Grand Canyon. And, as she says in her book, she basically had a complete and total emotional breakdown. And so I was well aware that these very smart, talented, strong writers had succumbed to the emotional weight of these stories. And I was also really well aware that I am such a sponge where emotions are concerned that I was
empathic.
Exactly. That I was going to absolutely head down that road before I even knew I was heading down it. And so I really pushed back against the idea of doing this book for a while because I was really worried that it might literally consume me.
We're going to have Jax Miller on later in the season, and she kind of went through the same thing, taking on a case. It seems like every writer I've talked to is 4 years. That's how long it takes. Exactly 4 years. So, but I mean, you think in the terms of your forever life, 4 years isn't very long, but you live, breathe, and eat this one specific case, for 4 consecutive years. And it can definitely take a toll on you, for sure.
100%. And one of the things I say in the book is that, when you think about true crime as it gets presented on, say a Netflix series or something, it's really well edited and it's almost sanitized, right? So you get maybe a blurry image of a body or a blood splatter or things like that. But it's so just sanitized, and all of those filters and all of those rules are off the table when you're actually investigating it. And so, I cannot describe what it is to sit with crime scene photos and autopsy photos, especially of people that you feel emotionally invested in, or sitting with family members who, 25 years later still just sob at the idea, that their daughters or their sisters or whatever were taken from them. And so, it's such a dark world, and I have so much respect for the investigators and the defense attorneys and the forensic psychologists who are willing to really get in the trenches and do this, because there's just no release for them,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm still having to come to terms with victim family interviews because I'm I have so many questions and I sit down in front of them and I think I'm the same as you. I'm just I'm so empathetic that if you cry, I'm going to cry. And then this whole thing is off and we can't do any of it. And so I really have great respect for people who just keep going and like most of the time disregard for their own mental health and really just want to tell these people's stories because they absolutely deserve to be told.
So do you have like rituals and things you do to leave those interviews and be able to kind of move on and live like a normal, healthy life? What do you do?
Nothing. I do not. No, I mean, I think I'm just too empathetic, and I'm just going to have to, I haven't figured it out after almost 3 years. I still haven't figured out how to leave that, in the office or whatever. It's always with me, always. And most of us, people like you, the ones who decide that you're going to take this case and you're going to write a whole book about it, I say those are your heart cases. Those are the ones where you can see yourself. You almost don't even have to be empathetic because there's so many similarities with that person or that case or their family or their lives or whatever that you just kind of put yourself automatically in their shoes. And I think all of us have a heart case, really. Was this kind of your heart case?
100%. And I love that term so much. I'm going to borrow it if it's okay. And I promise I'll give you credit for it. But yeah, no. And it's, there were some really dark days for me, and there are still some really dark days for me. But when I'm sort of at my lowest with all of this, I can go back to who Lolly and Julie were as people. I can go back to their love for each other. I can go back to their family and friends who I've, gotten to know really well over the past 5 years. And also some of the people working on this case. I partnered with the founder of the Virginia Innocence Project to reinvestigate the case. And if any of your listeners heard
Deidre, right?
And so if you heard the first series of Serial, the first season of Serial, you may know her as a character in that. And she is such a just badass woman. And, watching her do the work that she does every single day to get innocent people on death row, to get their lives back, knowing that she may have to watch their executions. It's such an inspiration for me because I can go write a different book about a different subject. She can't leave this. This is her entire life, and it will be for the rest of her life, And so people like that are such an inspiration for me that they keep me going when I feel like I'm done.
I think, that's one of my favorite parts, I think, about doing what I do, is that you don't realize how many like-minded people are out in the world, and they're up doing something. They're taking action, and you get to meet all of these people along the way and form these bonds that you never thought that you would ever form in your life.
It's really powerful, and I feel like there's something really unique about the true crime community too. In that is that I think first of all it takes a certain person to want to do a deep dive into one of these things, and I've been so just heartened and kind of inspired by the people who don't have a formal background in investigations or forensic psychology or whatever, but they're like, I'm committed to moving this case along. If we all work together and crowdsource it, we can move this case along. I mean, we saw that with the Zodiac Killer Cipher 2 years ago, right? Like 3 total amateurs get together and they solve it, right? And that's so exciting to me, to be able to do that work together, even if you're geographically apart. And so that's been one of my favorite things about this community.
People consume their information in different ways. Some people love to read. Some people love to watch movies or series. Some people like to listen to podcasts. And all of those things kind of intertwine together. And so when you have someone who is trying to share all of this information, try to get this, information out about like a certain case or whatever, it's really cool to see how authors and podcasters come together. I just heard that you just sold the film rights. And so, it's just really cool that you can just reach a bigger audience. It just keeps getting bigger and bigger.
Yeah. And we all work together. And when I was when I was writing the book, especially because this is not a closed case, it was really important to me that I sort of present the information that I could as objectively as possible so that readers could also participate, because what I want more than anything is for this case to be closed, for Lolly and Julie's friends and family to have closure, for the hiking community to have closure. And so, I present the case against this guy who was indicted, Daryl David Rice. I present that case. And then I also present the case against at least one, and I would argue maybe a couple of other really good suspects, because I want readers to be able to do what the FBI hasn't been willing to do, which is really pursue alternative suspects and come to a conclusion. And so it's really my hope that the book is starting a conversation as much as anything else.
That's something that you actually talk about a lot in the book, is this thing called confirmation bias, where you hear something and that's just the truth of it. And it's almost like when you're on the side of the police, maybe that's what you would see as tunnel vision or, something like that. But tell me a little bit about what you've seen of the confirmation bias. And you, I believe, even said yourself that you had it a little bit going into this case, right?
100%. And I'll be the first to admit that. I really came into this case assuming that the Department of Justice is always on the side of truth, that the FBI is really good at solving cases, that these investigators are always kind of open-minded and looking for the truth. And so if the Department of Justice came to us and said, Daryl David Rice must have killed Lolly and Julie, and we've indicted him and we're going to seek the death penalty against him, I assumed he must be guilty. And it was quite a while into the research for the book that I was like, he must be guilty because they wouldn't have indicted him otherwise. And it was really only after I started getting access to a lot of the evidence in the case that I was like, wait a minute, they don't actually have any evidence against this guy. And one of the things that I did was basically try to talk to anybody who would talk to me who had any kind of background in this. And I talked to several of the FBI agents who had worked the Yosemite murders, which, eventually became clear were the work of Carrie Stainer. And so what they told me was, after the first 3 women were killed, we actually interviewed Carrie Stainer, but at the time we were so sure that we already knew who the killer was that even though Carrie Stainer said some really suspicious things, we were like, well, it can't be him, so we let him go. And then he went on to commit at least one other murder. And it was these agents being willing to own that for me that was really, really, I think, helpful for my research.
And it wasn't that they didn't have any evidence in the case, because they did and they still do. It's just that they didn't have it against Rice, and they were trying to make that fit together, and it just wasn't fitting.
And they still if you talk to the 2 investigators who were most intimately involved in this case, they will still tell you that they are completely convinced that Daryl Rice did it, despite the fact that they don't have any evidence, despite the fact that I mentioned earlier that they sought the death penalty against him because they were so convinced that he hated gay people, that they had a quote, they had a tape of him saying, I hate gay people. And it wasn't until Deirdre Enright and his defense team said, well, could we listen to that tape? That they heard the context, which was Rice talking to a microphoned informant in his cell. And he said, man, I'm so angry. And the guy's like, why are you angry? And he was like, well, I'm really angry because they keep trying to make me say that I hate gay people. And, the informant was like, dude, that's whack. And Rice is like, right? I don't hate gay people. And all they did was snip that one little sentence, not only out of context, but turned it on its head 180 degrees. And the fact that our Department of Justice would do that to get a high profile conviction really shook me and made me rethink how these crimes are investigated and prosecuted.
Yeah, you would think that they would want the person that actually did it to be off the streets. You suspect that this case has to do with possibly a serial killer, right?
I do. So Lolly and Julie were murdered in late May of 1996. We think they were murdered on May 28th of 1996. In March of 1996, right outside of Shenandoah National Park, which is where Lolly and Julie were murdered, another young woman named Alicia Showalter Reynolds was murdered under pretty similar circumstances. So that was the first murder. Then we have Lolly and Julie. That's murder number 2 and number 3. Over the course of the next year, there were 5 other murders of women and teenage girls in this very small kind of radius of rural Virginia, a place that had previously seen next to no violent and deadly crime. We know one individual was responsible for at least 3 of those 8 murders. And I try to kind of offer an argument in the book about why I think that he might have been responsible for even more. So you are holding up this awesome map that this amazing cartographer named Margot Carpenter did. It's one of 3 maps that we put in the book that shows just how, I mean, look at that. It's a circle, right?
It's absolutely insane. Now, tell me how large, because most of my listeners are Southern. This is a Southern true crime podcast. And so I have no idea about this national park or how large it is. Can you tell our listeners just a little bit about the park itself?
Sure. So Shenandoah National Park I describe it as like a lizard. So it's kind of like long and narrow and squiggly, if you can kind of picture like a lizard on a log. And it was founded, one of the things that was really interesting to me was that when it was founded, thousands of Appalachian people, like Appalachian homesteaders, were evicted from their land in order to create this national park. And there is a lot of very long-standing animosity about the fact that people were like forcibly removed from their homes to create this park. One of the things that's really interesting about the park is that it's like, this long, narrow squiggle, and there's basically one road that goes through the long, narrow squiggle called Skyline Drive. And that's always really busy. Like if we were to show up right now, there would be like a bunch of cars and people taking pictures and things like that. And it's kind of running along the backbone of the Appalachian Mountains. But if you get on either side of that road, it's like really remote and really rural and really wooded. You're not going to see other people. You're not going to see like tent sites and fire pits and things like that. So in one way, it's really remote, but it's also only an hour and a half away from Washington, D.C. And so it gets a lot of traffic for people as well, too. And it's been a really challenging park to manage for people.
And of course, these maps are literally within her book. And it even shows on here where these other girls were found, where Julie and Lolly were camping at. And if you just look at it like an overview, you think, oh, well, those aren't very far apart.
They are actually pretty close. And what's also really interesting to me is that there's a lot of really some important similarities, I think, between these murders. Multiple of these murders involve either women or teenage girls who were found bound and gagged. Duct tape was involved in multiple ones. There was sexual assault, but sexual assault with like external objects, if I can say. And then all of these women, all of their bodies were found left in these super wilderness settings. Most of them were like wrapped up in either a sleeping bag or a blanket. Many of them were found near a river. And again, this is a super rural, pretty safe part of Virginia. And so, one of the founders of the FBI's behavioral analyst unit was like, it's pretty rare to have one serial killer working in an area. And the idea that there's 2 serial killers working here seems pretty close to impossible.
Hey, it's happened. Did anybody live in California in the 70s? Come on.
Fair enough.
But all of the things that you just mentioned has a lot of similarities to Julie and Lolly's crime scene, right?
Right. Yeah. And that was why, and again, once Darrell Rice kind of became the focus for the FBI and the National Park Service Police, they were really only interested in him. And it wasn't until this known serial killer who had killed 3 of these victims kidnapped a young woman named Kara Robinson. She was 15 years old, and she just heroically managed to escape and report him to authorities, and then prompted this high-speed chase, and he ended up committing suicide as the police were kind of bearing down on him. And at that point, the FBI was like, whoa, okay, this guy is a super bad, creepy dude. And also, you know, we know he's murdered at least 3 people. He's kidnapped another one who he fully intended to murder. And so the FBI created a task force dedicated to looking at this guy, Mark Ivanitz, for other murders across the country, you know, spanning from Florida to California to Maine. And they did briefly look at him for the Shenandoah murder, to the extent that they even compared his DNA to the DNA found at the crime scene. The FBI lab told them, this is an almost perfect match. You cannot rule this guy out as a suspect. And then the FBI was like, thanks very much, but we're done looking at Mark Ivanitz for any other crimes. Could you just run that DNA against Daryl Rice, even though it didn't match the 5 other times that you ran it? And that was where, again, as like an investigative journalist, I'm like, what the hell is going on here? They have tested Rice against every scrap of evidence found at that murder scene, and none of it matches him. And, you know, obviously that doesn't prove that somebody didn't do it, right? But they don't have any evidence proving that Rice did it, you know. And then meanwhile, they have this known serial killer who's killed other people, you know, in a very similar fashion, right around the park. You know, the crime lab comes back and says, look, we ran this DNA at 600 positions, right? 600 points. And at 599 points, this guy's DNA matches the DNA found at the crime scene. And the FBI is like, yeah, we're not going to look into that anymore, which is like, for me, that's criminal.
That's insane to me. Like that makes no sense to me. And that's what like is the tunnel vision. Why do you want this guy so bad? He doesn't match, but here's this other guy. We're telling you like we cannot rule him out in any form or fashion. Why do you think we're so tunneled in on Rice?
I think there's a couple of things going on. I think, first of all, because this was such a high profile case, because it was the first federal hate crime and got so much attention, I feel like the Department of Justice wasn't willing to backtrack and say they got it wrong because they were so public about saying that they got it right. So I think that's part of it. I think that, you know, some of the investigators who were working on this crime, first of all of the lead investigators who worked on this crime were not homicide experts. When a crime happens in these wilderness public lands like the National Park Service, basically what happens is the FBI has to team up with the National Park Service police, right? So first of all, those are 2 radically different cultures, as I talk about in the book, and they don't really like each other. And neither of them really have experience as homicide detectives. I think in a lot of ways, like a local town or county homicide detective is going to have infinitely more experience than these investigators did. And so they didn't really know, I think, what they were doing. They were like super stressed out, like, and then they also were kind of, I don't want to say backwards. Can I say like parochial maybe, or provincial in their...
You can say whatever you want.
So because this other guy, Mark Ivanitz, because 3 of his victims were teenagers, they all decided, well, he's a pedophile. Because if you like a 15-year-old, you must be a pedophile, which, by the way, is not the definition of pedophilia, right? Pedophilia is a sexual attraction to a prepubescent person. These were like, yes, they were young teenage girls, women, but their bodies, you know, were like fully formed sexual bodies. You know, they're so convinced that he's a pedophile because some of his victims were in their teens that they're like, well, Lolly and Julie were 24 and 26, so you can't like a 15-year-old and a 24 and a 26-year-old. And then, you know, they were like, we got into his house and we looked at all of his stuff and we looked at his porn, and his porn collection involved like women who were like waxed or shaved. So that's other proof that he's, a pedophile. And in my head, I'm like, seeing porn? Because everybody is waxed and shaved, And so but it was that kind of like small town thinking that really kind of led them to say it's impossible that this guy could have, killed these two young looking 24 and 26-year-olds.
Also, something that you talk about, there is no system put in place for reporting on violent crimes in national parks, right?
This was really disturbing to me. So it's at the sort of whim of whoever is the superintendent of a national park, and so one park may decide to report a violent crime, another park may decide not to. Some parks don't even have any law enforcement rangers working there. And so the story that I got, the conclusion that I came to doing the research for this book was we don't even know how many violent crimes are actually happening in our national parks. We don't even know to what degree they're safe and dangerous. And, couple that with the number of people who are already feeling unsafe in the wilderness. And we have a major problem that as a country, we have, I think, an ethical and moral responsibility to be working much harder on.
We didn't really talk about the crime scene because as you mentioned, this is it's pretty gory. And you describe everything in such detail that I really think that, if you want to know exactly what happened to these girls, if you want to see the timeline of what happened, exactly when, where, how, and what, listeners out there, if you want to know about it, you're going to have to go by Trailed, One Woman's Quest to Solve the Shenandoah Murders. The most important part here is, what do you think that we should be doing collectively as a whole, at maybe even the highest level, to try to keep people safe outdoors?
Yeah, it's such a good question. The national park system, for instance, has like a $6 billion backlog of, maintenance. And that's not just physical maintenance. It's also like training and equipping rangers. So that's part of it. I think there's also there's been a pretty pervasive version of toxic masculinity in terms of the wilderness, and a certain set of white men, which I think, thankfully is a very tiny set of white men who honestly think the wilderness is theirs and rules don't apply to them. And so, there's been these other murders of people like Meredith Emerson, people like, Claudia, Brenner and Rebecca White, other National Park Service murders where when the perpetrators are actually brought to justice, their defense is basically, well, the women deserved it, or I was hunting and they were my prey. And so until we address that and make it so that people don't get to do that in the wilderness, then we do have the safety problem, and we do have good reason for some people to be like, am I okay if I go out there?
That being said, what are some of your personal safety tips for us ladies who, or gentlemen who maybe want to get out into the wilderness?
Yeah. And I think, if the idea of being alone in the wilderness is creepy to you, I think, finding a group or an organization, I love to trail run. It's my favorite thing in the world. I belong to a trail running group where, we meet up on Monday nights and we run together. And if you, have Meetup as an app on your phone, there's always hiking groups of super awesome humans who are totally worth your time anyway. So that's the first thing. And then I think, investing in these organizations that I mentioned before, who are really trying to create inclusivity for the wilderness, is super important as well.
And last question, is Rice the Route 29 killer?
No. Absolutely not. I will stake my reputation on that 100%.
I knew what your answer was going to be, but I had to ask you because it was just so ridiculous.
I didn't even know about the Route 29 killer and stalker. And yeah, no, I firmly believe in Daryl Rice's innocence. I believe that this is a social justice catastrophe. The Justice Department completely ruined the life of Darrell Rice in a way that he's never going to get it back again. And I would have zero problems going on a backpacking trip with Darrell Rice and feeling completely safe while I was doing it.
They did prosecute him, actually, and then they ended up where they dismissed the case without prejudice, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I should say, to be totally transparent, Darrell Rice got on the radar of the FBI, the National Park Service Police, because he did harass and threaten a woman who was cycling in Shenandoah National Park in 1997. And, I think it's really important to acknowledge that. It's also important to acknowledge that he served his time for that crime and has never been connected to another crime. But yes, you're absolutely right. So when faced with no evidence against him, the federal government dismissed this case without prejudice, which means that this guy is one of the only people in this entire country who basically lives in a state of double jeopardy, where the federal government can bring back this capital case against him whenever they want to. And he, that plus the publicity, plus the FBI insisting that he did it, has basically meant that he can't even live in the world anymore. He basically lives underground anonymously as like a quasi-homeless person because it's the only way he feels safe. And given that not only did he serve the sentence for the one thing he did, and that there's no evidence to suggest that he did these crimes, I think as a country, we owe him his life back and what we've taken away from him.
I actually am with you on that. I think that, well, at least after reading your book, because you lay everything out so well, and you didn't leave any stone unturned. So, thank you so much for being with me today. I'm so glad that you were here talking with me about this today.
I'm so glad to be here. I really appreciate you giving time to Lolly and Julie's story. And I really hope your listeners will feel free to kind of join in this hunt to close this case, because I can use all the help I can get for sure.
Absolutely. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in today. You can find Trailed, One Woman's Quest to Solve the Shenandoah Murders in bookstores near you on Amazon, Kindle, and Audible. I have both, the hardback and the Audible version. www.kathrynmiles.net.
After I wrapped my conversation with Kathryn Miles, a breakthrough finally came. Nearly 28 years after the nightmare in Shenandoah National Park, Virginia, the FBI named the killer. It was announced in June of 2024 that Walter Leo Jackson Sr., a convicted serial rapist from the Cleveland area, had been conclusively linked to the murders of Julie Williams and Lolly Winans. New DNA testing, re-examined in 2021, pulled evidence from the crime scene and entered it into CODIS, the FBI's DNA database. The result? A match to Jackson, whose profile was already on file from previous convictions. The odds of error? Essentially zero. Jackson, a residential painter, an avid hiker with familiarity in Shenandoah, died in prison in 2018, meaning the families will never witness a trial. Still, as U.S. Attorney Christopher Kavanaugh said, after 28 years, we are now able to say who committed the brutal murders of Lolly Winans and Julie Williams, offering some small measure of solace. But what does Kathryn Miles make of this long-awaited resolution? In interviews following the announcement, she spoke of the uphill emotional journey she and the victims' loved ones have traveled together. She told the Washington Post that the impact of the killings went far beyond the crime itself, shattering safe spaces for hikers, especially women and queer travelers. While authorities found no evidence of a bias motive, Miles said she still thinks of it as a hate crime in spirit, given the terror it inspired in marginalized outdoor communities. On the National Park After Dark podcast, its co-hosts spent an hour with Miles reflecting on the case. She sat with the weight of that long-awaited breakthrough, not just as a journalist, but as someone who poured years of her life into the case. She described how the families of Julie and Lolly were caught in a storm of conflicting emotions. On one hand, there was relief. relief that the name of the killer, Walter Leo Jackson Sr., had finally been confirmed through DNA, offering a long-denied certainty. At last, there was an answer to the question that had haunted everyone for nearly 3 decades. But alongside that relief came an overwhelming grief, not just for the lives lost, but for the kind of resolution that will never come. Jackson died in prison in 2018, years before his connection to the crime was made. There would be no trial, no cross-examination, no public reckoning. Justice, Kathryn told the Washington Post, has a hollow echo when the accused is already gone. She also reflected on the frustration that justice delayed is not justice denied, but justice distorted. The families had to live without answers, while the truth slipped further into the void. And now, even with an answer, there is no accountability in the courtroom, no clarity for the public record, no opportunity to confront the monster who stripped 2 young women of their lives and their future. She added that this bittersweet closure asks more questions than it answers. Who else might he have harmed? What forensic mistakes still linger? What broader failures did this case shine a light on? She says the case may be closed in name, but in spirit, the investigation and the search for meaning has only just begun.
Thank you for listening to this chapter of conversations with some of our world's dark storytellers. This story may be over for now.
The next chapter is always waiting to be written.
Until then,
Dreadfully yours, Raven Rollins.